Welcome to the Climate Hive Show. What do you solve? Where we sit down with global game changers on climate. My name is Kevin Drolet, aka Kedro, and I'm here with my co-founder and co-host Mike Higgins, aka Higo. And we were at Green Biz 2026, Trellis Green Biz, and we were excited because we got to meet Andrew Shakman from Leanpath and had a great conversation, and we get to extend that conversation here today. Andrew Shakman is the founder and CEO of Leanpath, a company that is providing the industry's most complete food waste management system. He's been working for more than 2 decades on one of the world's largest hidden problems, food waste. And a couple quick tidbits about Andrew that you may not know that I thought was interesting is that he didn't start out in sustainability. He actually studied at Stanford and earned a graduate degree in motion picture producing at UC before becoming a serial tech entrepreneur. He did start Leanpath in 2024 and helped create the first automated system for measuring food waste in commercial kitchens based on the simple idea that if you measure it, you can change it. And today, Leanpath tools are used in thousands of kitchens, I think in 50 countries around the world, helping organizations cut waste, save money, reduce their environmental impact. So, Andrew, thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to pass it over to my good man, Higo, to kick us off on the show.
Andrew, welcome. Thank you so much for the time today. We really appreciate it. As the name of the show suggests, we're here to hear the story of the aha moment, the inspiration, and then the action behind that. So I'll start with the simple question out of the gates. What do you solve?
Yes. So we have been working on solving the problem of food waste in food service. And let me just talk a bit about what that problem really is. So if you look globally, we're wasting somewhere around a third of the food that we produce, wasting or losing, whether it's on farm or it's in an operation or in the supply chain. So that's stunning. A third of production not ultimately creating value as food. And we know that a big chunk of that is happening in the retail, sort of at the retail level, which is either food retail or it's restaurants and food service. And that's where we focus. And we have seen that particular part of the problem as being highly actionable, that it is something that with focus, we can absolutely improve materially. And so if you look at the problem and why we would care about it, first and foremost, it's money that people are putting in the garbage. You buy food, you don't create value from it, it gets thrown away or composted, and you have spent money in a low margin business to begin with and gotten nothing for it. So just right there, there's perhaps $1 trillion a year being lost related to food loss and waste. So just the economic argument is pretty compelling as a standalone. But that is only a piece of this. This is really a nexus issue that brings together a range of problems that can be solved by reducing food waste. We have food insecurity. A significant percentage of the world is not sure exactly what's going to happen in terms of their next meal, and yet we're throwing away a third of the food. We look at climate, of course, and we know that 8 to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions are created in the process of growing, transporting, or discarding food that we've wasted. And we know that that's a significant climate impact, but it's not just the CO2 side of that. The fact is when food is rotting, it produces methane, and methane is a short-lived climate pollutant. And so if we have the ability to mitigate the amount of methane, we have the ability to have a faster impact on warming overall. There are other issues, biodiversity loss that occurs with land conversion to grow food that we're going to waste, water resources. I could go on down the list. This is a nexus issue. Money, climate, resources, soil health, and people not having enough to eat. So for all those reasons, this is a problem that needs to be addressed. And when Drawdown looked at the top climate problems, depending upon which model you look at, they ranked food waste prevention and reduction as either the number 1 or number 3 thing that we can do to impact climate change. So this is, it's a big problem and it's a big opportunity, and that's what we're excited about solving.
I mean, it's stunning, right? I'm sitting here listening to these numbers, and they're huge. It's, and And when I hear about food waste, where does the food waste actually happen? Is it in the
Yeah.
kitchen, the production from the field? Is it storage? Is it the forecasting that the restaurant is doing in terms of how much it'll sell? Where is it coming from?
I want to answer yes. It's happening in all of those places, right?
Yes.
Throughout the supply chain. It can vary based on where you are and what the issues are that drive waste. And the area that I focus on is in food service and hospitality. And in that world, what we see is there are two primary food waste issues. Pre-consumer food waste, which is what happens behind the scenes in a restaurant or food service operation, and plate waste, which is what's left on a guest's plate at the end of a meal. On the pre-consumer part of the problem, the number one reason for that is overproduction. We made more than we needed, and we ended up wasting it. We also see a lot of trim waste from converting fresh produce or meat from a purchased portion to an edible portion. We see dropped, burned, contaminated, spoiled, expired. There are a number of reasons why pre-consumer waste happens, but usually half or more is overproduction. On the plate waste side, it could be that portions are too big. It could be that people didn't like the food quality didn't work for people. Or it could just be behavioral. People had, for example, a buffet and they took more than, their eyes were bigger than their stomach, right?
Mhm.
So there are a variety of reasons in the food service environment why waste happens. But one of the things that I was fascinated to learn in my journey, and I've been at this now for 22 years, and I realized that there was a relationship between the way people managed risk and the food waste that they produced. So there's a lot of challenges when you're a food service operator and you want to make sure that you're running a great business. And sometimes you solve those challenges by wasting food. So for example, you don't want to run out. Who wants to run out? Who wants to disappoint someone by not having what they want? So what do? You make a little extra. And that makes sense. Except if everybody involved, whoever planned the meal, whoever produced the meal, served the meal, adds a little padding, suddenly you've got a lot more than you've needed. And that's an area where you're managing the risk of running out and the cost is wasting food. Another one is food safety. And to be clear, I am 100% behind serving safe food. But there's this old saying about food, if in doubt, throw it out. Well, I think we can do better than that. I think if in doubt, we should understand what's going on and we should be thinking carefully about, is this food good? Is this food not good? Why? And how can we protect this precious resource? We worry about food not being beautifully and bountifully merchandised because people won't
Mhm.
buy one item if there's not a bunch of accompanying items. Think about the pile of apples in a grocery store. So we have a lot of apples knowing we'll never sell them all. We're managing the risk of not making the sale. And in turn, we're spending food waste as a currency. And the thought is that that food waste isn't that expensive, but it is. It's the
Mhm.
cost of the food, it's the cost of the labor that goes into it, and it's the environmental externalities, all of which we've talked about here, that make it incredibly expensive and much more so than people realize. So those are some of the dynamics around why it happens.
Your system is looking at both the pre and post
Yeah.
and measuring and creating data and analytics on both sides. Okay. So
Yeah.
you're not just
Yeah.
dealing with one side.
No, we do both, Mike. And where Leanpath enters the picture, right? We've talked about the problem and we've talked about why the problem happens and the dynamics
Yeah.
in food service. So the question obviously is, what do you do to fix it? And what we recognized was that kitchens are a form of factory, but we don't typically manage them the way factories are managed with management science, like lean process improvement and Six Sigma. All of these disciplines that develop to create more efficiency and quality in manufacturing had really not made their way into the kitchen. And so we asked the question, what if we could take some of the learnings from those disciplines, distill them, and deploy that in a kitchen? And so that was where we began on our journey. And what we ended up focusing on was implementing one key element, which was measuring food waste daily, both how much and what it is. And once you do that, you can have data-driven discovery, team-based problem solving, and change making. But the key enabler is it's got to be easy. because no one has extra time in a kitchen. So Leanpath's solution is a technology platform for enterprise food waste management that begins with tools to measure waste, AI-based computer vision, cameras, scales in some cases to measure the weight, in some cases getting some context from people who are throwing it away as to why they're throwing it away, and then an analytics platform that organizes all that information into actionable framing, and then finally workflow management tools to drive people to take those actions and know how they're working. And to do that both in the unit and also for multi-unit operators above the unit in an enterprise context, so that someone who has hundreds or thousands of operations can see where it's working and where it isn't. So that's the Leanpath solution, really invented in response to that perspective that we were leaving some tools behind that had worked well in other manufacturing environments. We could bring them here, but we had to adapt them, and we had to bring a healthy dose of empathy and a healthy dose of adaptation to that space. And so that's what we do.
When I was a teenager, my friend Ed, he used to dumpster dive. So he basically was like, I'm gonna live a year on trash, right? And this, I think we had like graduated high school, and that's what he was riding trains and living a year on trash. And it was really cool because actually what he did is he went and he found stuff that grocery stores threw away. And all these vegetables, for example, that were like,
Perfectly good.
beaten up, yeah. And he make apple pies and like all this kind of stuff. And at first we were like, that's kind of gross, man. Dude's like in the trash cans. And then I went with him one day and he was just like, it was amazing, right? It was like amazing the amount of food that gets, thrown away just because it's ugly. And I know that's a very small part, of like, what
Oh,
you do, but, in terms of identifying, but you're like, so you guys do 100 million pounds of food waste in 50 countries,
have
right?
helped
Like
to prevent that much from going
you've
in the
helped to
environment. In
prevent that
fact, it's
much.
actually quite a bit higher than that, but that's what we've published to date. Yeah.
Because that is like I was trying to figure out like how do you understand what 100 million pounds is of food, and this is primarily in service, right? In like the service industry.
Yeah. It's
Can,
food
can you give us
service and
some
hospitality.
can you give us some context for like what's 100 million pounds, like how much food waste is there coming out of like hospitality? How much have you been able to tackle? How much is there to go? And what's I'm really curious, like what's the receptiveness to Lean Path? Because I think we talked on a previous show about inertia or people not wanting to kind of change the way they're doing things. And I would just be really interested to learn about, how you're getting minds to change, behaviors to change as you're, doing these hundreds of millions of, food waste. Uh,
Yeah, well, first of all, as to the scope of the problem, one rule of thumb that we use is the idea that 1.2 pounds represents a meal. So you can do a conversion of prevented pounds of food waste and convert that into meals. And it's rough, but it gives you a sense of what that would be. And we, of course, are understanding what we prevented because we know what the baseline is in any operation and we know what they're doing along the way in contrast, and we can measure the amount of that contrast. So that's how we know how much has been prevented, and then we can convert that into meals. We can also convert it into GHGs and things of that sort. So that's the enormity of the problem. It's huge, and it's really hard to wrap your head around a number that big. But when you break it down to meals, I think we can all get it a little bit more clearly. In terms of bringing this into operations and how do people react and how do people relate to it, it is it is very important that this is a safe issue to talk about. And when I started on this journey and I would show up in people's kitchens, chefs would be very nervous about my presence. And in many cases, they would say, "Oh, we don't have any food waste here." I remember one here near my office. I went to tour space, and they said, "Yeah, the whole tour was showing me how they didn't have waste." And yet, what I saw was they actually did have waste, but there was almost willful blindness about it. And there was, and when you would challenge it, what people would say, "Well, that's not really waste. I had to make that," or "That's not really waste. I had to trim that fish," or "That's not really waste." And so everybody, what you find, has a very personal story in their mind that around justifying what is waste. Trying to find a
mm.
common definition for waste is a challenge because it's all in the eye of the beholder.
So true.
Right. And that's really the concept of circularity, even, right? One person's concept of something that's unneeded that might be waste is someone else's input to a process that they can then do something with. So when we began, there was this alignment period where people felt it was unsafe, it was a little scary, someone's going to come audit me, and maybe I'm going to get in trouble. They're going to highlight my weaknesses. And I don't even think it's waste to begin with, might be the kinds of things you would experience. And what we said is, look, this isn't your fault. You didn't intend to come to work and waste food. Nobody does. Nobody gets into hospitality wanting to waste food. People love food. That's why they get involved. They respect food. But the circumstances of this work require us to move at a high speed. We have no extra time. And as I said earlier, we pay for some of our priorities by wasting food. No one's starting with a bad intention, right? So start there and just say the best operators are the ones who are willing to deal with this transparently, willing to talk about it, measure it, solve it, because it's not personal to you. So if you can make it not a penalty and position it as a leadership activity and a best practice and what the best, most forward-thinking culinarians are doing, people will typically come on that journey. And I've been amazed how it's changed over time. And now when you talk to most chefs, they fully acknowledge that food waste is an opportunity. And it's no longer the case where people are, I mean, occasionally you run into it, but mostly people say, yeah, this is an issue. And it's one that we want to work on and we can work on. And so bringing, it's got to be safe though. Got to be safe and it's got to be actionable. You can't bring people extra work and you can't bring people data collection that doesn't lead to outcomes. So it's got to be something that starts with a respect and understanding of what a chef is dealing with and brings them tools to make it better without making their life harder.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you used the word, high, fast paced, because I was a food prep at a pretty high volume restaurant when I was in high school, right? And it was all about fast, and
Yeah.
so, I think about kitchens, fast means careless to some extent, right? You're not really cutting precisely. You got to get the ends off those green beans. You've got a huge box, right? So, you're motoring through it. But I would imagine, because I'm trying to put together in my mind, how your data is, shared, implemented, and executed at the kitchen level.
Yeah.
Is it like a week over week, like, hey guys, we had 25 pounds last week. Our goal this week is 20. Like, but there has to be a compromise because something has to give. You can't keep at the same speed and then expect better results. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Well, I think your question is really important, right? Because there's so many pressures on operators. And so our first goal is just to make measurement super easy. So using AI to identify what it is that's being wasted and making that process very, very simple and easy is the first step, right, in doing anything. And then bringing that data back in a way that's useful to people is the next step. And
Mm.
usually there's three things that people will do differently. They'll either purchase differently, they will produce differently, or they will create a menu that is different based on what they're wasting routinely, how much it costs, right? So frequency and cost of waste items will often direct people to engineer things. So for example, with your green beans analogy, maybe those are consuming too much labor. And maybe that's not the right thing to have on the menu. It's possible. I'm not saying, I mean, I like green beans, so I want to see them on the menu, but that's one question someone might ask for their operation. The
Mm.
next thing, though, is you realize that remember I said over half of the food waste that we see, pre-consumer food waste, is due to overproduction. And that means you're not just wasting food, but you're also wasting labor. You're wasting the time people put into it. So imagine if we can reduce that overproduction. We're not just saving on food costs, we're saving people's time. And so the greatest risk to time that I see in a kitchen is making food we don't need rather than how we transform the green beans and those sorts of things. I also think with good training, with good knife skills, people can get quicker and better and safely transform that product. One of my colleagues, our executive chef, Rob White, is he's been a chef for over 40 years, and he is adept at helping people see those trade-offs, looking at data and understanding where there may be something that they've thought of as sacrosanct, something that couldn't be challenged and needs to be. And the truth is, we have a lot of elephants in the kitchen that we no longer see clearly, that need to be ushered out or at least challenged, at least scooted to one side or the other.
Yeah.
And when we do that, creativity is unleashed. And I'll share one story. I've seen people have come to me and said, when I say, hey, cut down on overproduction, they say, well, I have a buffet. In many cases, people do. And they say, I have a standard that the last person who walks through that buffet has to see the same thing that the first person saw. Okay, sounds reasonable on the surface, right? Like, we don't want anyone to have a bad experience. Well, then you step back and you go, okay, but that means that you're going to close that buffet full, right? If the last person saw what the first person saw, it's going to be full. It will be a waste generation engine. Let's think about that differently. Do I, at 8:55 in the morning, going through a buffet for breakfast, want to eat eggs that have been there for an hour? Or would I like to see a sign that says, we'd like to cook your eggs to order. What would you like? As I'm one of the last few people through breakfast. Yeah, I'd like those eggs cooked to order for me right now. That's a win for me as a customer, and it's a win for them in not having a giant pan of scrambled eggs to throw out. So those kinds of opportunities where it's win-win, it's not win-loss, are more plentiful than people realize.
And it's economically viable too, right? I mean, you had showed us a video, which I hope we'll cut to and show, but it's this amazing video that, it's sort of like chefs cutting up money, and then the money transforms and it becomes food that goes out on the table, and then it comes
Yeah,
back and it's just money being dumped. But from the behavior change or people taking this up, can you talk a little bit about, give us like some color in terms of, is it motivating people like, hey, they're saving X number of dollars in the production? At
yeah.
what point in using your system do people go like, have their aha moment and you know say, hey, we're gonna make this change?
It's pretty quick. Honestly,
Mm,
when you start measuring, usually people have never had this data before. I
mm,
remember we were working on a buffet in Las Vegas that closed, I want to say at 11 p.m., and it was a huge buffet. And they walked back and they started measuring things, and they came back with a whole bunch of crab legs. And I remember the sous chef was like, I am never doing this again. Like, I can't, like, the cognitive loop was closed. The
mm.
moment you see it, you go, oh, okay. Like, I do not want this to be repeated, right? And so I think that it's uh, it's not hard to get people's attention, and it's also important though to convert the weight of the waste into economic value. And so we do that. So for every item, we have many items you're tracking. We have a cost per pound for each of those items. So where you are losing money. And so the roadmap to improvement is pretty clear. And as a chef, one of your top priorities is food productivity. You need to deliver food cost at a level that's appropriate for your budget and your operation. And one of the ways you get there is by controlling waste. And if you do that job really well, it actually allows you to put more value back on the plate rather than in the garbage. So you can even have better financial performance and better experience, or balance between the two, right? You choose. Do you want to put all those savings on the plate, all those savings in the budget? But the economics are core. I don't think that you can get anything to be sustained in any operation that isn't economically viable and sustainable. And at the onset, what happens is when people reduce waste, they are changing year over year performance, right? So they are seeing that, oh, last year my food cost was a 35, and this year it's going to be a 33. Like, that kind of change is fabulous. Then there's a point where you've wrung out a lot of the impact. And I think you asked earlier, how much opportunity is there? There's usually a lot of opportunity, even when people have wrung out a lot, because this is a problem that's pretty big to start with. But there's a point where you pushed, and then you're getting into a mode from reduction into suppression, control, cost avoidance. So this goes from a cost reduction tool to an insurance tool. And I will often get the question, people will say, hey, if I'm super successful with LeanPath and I deploy this program and I reduce my waste, why do I need to keep doing it? And I say, well, and I would use an analogy that's quickly going out of style, but I'd say, let's talk about cash. Let's talk about your cash drawer. And, there are still cash drawers out there. And I'd say, do you reconcile that every day? And they'd say, of course, if I didn't, I would be losing money right and left. And I say, yeah. And does it usually balance? Yeah. Are you going to stop reconciling it? No. And so the same analogy works for food waste. It's you are in one of two states. You are either in control of your food waste or it is out of control. And so that's where a food waste management platform like LeanPath comes in. Initially, we're going to squeeze the savings out, and then we're going to keep them out. And then if there's backsliding, we're going to highlight it, identify it, and address it.
Yeah, that's repetition and reinforcement, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of turnover in staff in restaurants. So it's
Mm.
it's one of those constantly,
Yeah.
you always got to be letting people know, because I'm glad you brought up Vegas because my mind instantly went to Vegas when I was thinking about food waste because of those ridiculous buffets, you know. And I have seen, we've all been to Vegas and just plates go in the trash can that are full. I don't know how you solve that because that's the consumer, but but at the end of the day, from the kitchen perspective, if you're able to measure it, you're able to manage it. So,
Yeah.
I would imagine, and Vegas measures everything.
Yeah. I was going to say they're some of the best operators, period.
Yeah.
And they're able to produce these amazingly beautiful food experiences and at the same time be accountable for some really significant food cost targets. And it's about getting them the tools to be able to do that
Yeah.
well. And you touched on a second ago, you talked about turnover, and the reality is nothing stays the same in a food service operation.
Yeah.
Employees change, managers change, menus change, seasons change, expectations change from the consumer side. We are managing constant change. And so the hard part is here, it's not about how do I come up with a really unique solution to food waste. This is more about how do I do the right thing every day at scale. They can be simple things, but done consistently at scale is where we have dramatic impact. So we don't need exotic answers. This isn't about how do I use this, very exotic tiny bit of trim that comes off of this particular animal to do something in a very fancy five-star kind of experience, right? Like this is much more about how do I not make too much? How do I trim efficiently? Those kinds of things. And doing that every day.
Yeah, it's so I'm having like this profound moment of clarity or like surprise almost because food, like I have family that have had restaurants and the margins are so thin for food. You would think that like with the margins being so thin that, there wouldn't be all this waste, and yet there is. And the waste has almost been part of the margins. Uh, but it makes me
Yeah.
curious, like how and feel free to speak to that, but it does make me curious, like just how you, Andrew, like how you came to like, hey, we're gonna go into food service and like hospitality, and because you know
Yeah.
there's a lot of probably different directions you could have gone on the measurement thing, but why the focus here?
Yeah. First of all, I grew up in a household where my parents taught me not to waste things. And it was funny. I was recently looking at photos of me with my dad over the years, and he's alive and well. But I realized in almost every photo, he's wearing the same jacket that he has patched over and over and over. I'm getting older. The jacket is looking a little more beat up, but it's still the same jacket. So I grew up with just a sense that resources are precious and to be respected. My father also happens to be a physician with a specialty in preventive medicine. So he's all about fixing the problem before it becomes a problem rather than fixing it after. And I didn't realize that until I was a number of years into LeanPath. I said, these were some patterns that were imprinted early in my life, not to waste and to get ahead of the problem. So those things were, I guess, latently dwelling there at the time that I discovered food waste. And it was really just luck. A couple of things collided and I started to look at this. I'd been working in my first business in technology for food companies, but it was consumer facing. We were marketing consumer products, and I accrued some karmic debt there because I was busy doing things like trying to get kids to buy more Captain Crunch pre-sweetened cereal, which, I guess is a beautiful thing in very, 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 very small amounts every
Captain
once in a
Crunch
while.
is a beautiful thing, Andrew. I
Yeah,
don't.
but what I was doing was not good for for overall health and wellness of young folks. And I didn't see it at the time, right?
Mm.
But now I do, and I'm working off that karmic debt. But overall, I was in that food and tech space, but in a different zone. And I had this opportunity where I found myself looking at food waste and immediately resonated. I said, gosh, that's money in the garbage, and we shouldn't be doing that. And so I started looking at it. I talked to some operators, and they said, yeah, if you measure, it was one gentleman named Ken who was an important influence early, and he'd been an operator. And he said, yeah, I was once doing measurement just with a piece of paper, and I saved, I think it was 8 points of food cost just by doing that. And he was like, this works. And I was like, and so when you talk to people who say, yeah, this works, you then begin to focus on it. What was maybe unique about the Leanpath journey is that we started before this was a thing that people were really embracing. We were at the very vanguard of trying to get people to pay attention to this, and we were probably a little early. And I joke that the name of the company also describes the first 7 years of its existence. It was a lean path. And there were many times where I had to sit there and really challenge myself, like, should we be doing this? Because it's not commercially working very well. And so one of the things I started doing was going out and trying to educate people on the problem. Because in order to get someone to buy our product, first they had to understand that food waste was a problem. Then they needed to understand that prevention was the number one thing they could do about it. Then they needed to understand that the best way to get to prevention was through measurement. Measurement was actually a proxy for prevention. And then finally, they had to get to the point where they realized that they needed technology to help automate that and make it easy. So we had to build that pyramid with every person. And that required a lot of change making. And so I was out telling the first layer of the story over and over again. And there's that old saying, if you really want to learn something, first someone shows it to you, then you do it yourself. But if you really want to know it, you teach it. And I
Mm.
went anywhere anyone would let me teach it. And as I learned it and I recognized all the environmental impacts, social impacts, food insecurity, climate, land conversion, water use, my jaw dropped. I'd been working on an economic problem. And then I realized as I was out there building the whole story for people, this is too big a problem. We can't quit. Even though the commercial piece wasn't there, we can't quit. And so in many ways, I think the most interesting part of the Leanpath journey was that we didn't quit because the headwinds were
Yeah.
strong. And what ended up happening was finally there was a breakthrough and people started to see it. There were food cost inflation moments. There was a big movement on sustainability that broke out. And then people came to realize there's 200 things I can do that are sustainable. What's one thing I can do that impacts many positives? And it was food waste, and it became central. So that's how this evolved from my
That
personal journey.
that's interesting. So did the tailwinds for Lean Path actually come through to some degree, like companies wanting to be more sustainable in practice versus like they wanted to save money, or like it's curious.
Money first.
Money
So
first.
the early era was all about economic savings.
Yeah.
And I would say in every instance, there was always a financial business case driving our customers to do something. Like there would be, maybe there's a few exceptions, but for the most part, everybody's, and as I said earlier, right, to be financially viable and sustainable, there's got to be a return on investment. So that was always core. When sustainability came into the mix, it became a really helpful tailwind because when you're knocking on someone's door and you're saying you should be more productive with food, you're standing in line with 50 other things that are knocking on the same door saying we can save you a penny here and a nickel there. And the people who are responsible for food productivity and operational excellence are inundated, and yet they're trying to
Mm.
run their business, right? So how much new can they really introduce while they're trying to optimize? And when you got the sustainability support, what would happen was a sustainability leader in a company would walk down the hall to their colleague in operational excellence and say, hey, jump this one to the front of the line because I think this one is going to be a triple bottom line for us. This is going to meet your needs. It's going to help margin and bottom line, and it's going to help our sustainability objectives. And when those alignments occurred, then suddenly everybody was pushing in that direction. So there was a symbiotic relationship, I guess, or just say a complementary relationship between operational excellence, sustainability, culinary leaders that got to a point where this was prioritized.
You talk about food waste as a problem. You know, really until we met and until we started having these conversations, I had no idea of the scope of the problem. So, and I think a lot of people don't. They just don't recognize it, right? Why do you think food waste as a problem is so overlooked as part
Yeah,
of our sustainability,
I love that
strategies?
question. Mike, it's a great question. I mean, first of all, it's everywhere and it's so built into our culture that we just don't see it. I mentioned the elephant in the kitchen, but the truth is it's in all of our kitchens at home. Even when I try to host an event or put on Thanksgiving or something, there's no one wants to run out, right? So we're all
Right.
wired to sort of be in this place where we naturally want to be hospitable and so it's very much pervasive. But I think in the sustainability world, there's been a lot of focus, as there should be, on climate. And there's been a lot of focus on circularity. And food waste has gotten its day in the sun of late. What hasn't happened is all of that hasn't connected into one cohesive story. And so while Drawdown makes the point that if we stop land converting in order, so the basic premise, right, is to feed 10 billion people in 2050, we're either going to land convert the rest of the Amazon and create all kinds of negative feedback loops and continue climate destruction, or we're going to need to waste less food and use the food we make productively. That's the premise at a macro level. But when you come down to a micro level of how do I, as a company, connect what I'm doing on food waste prevention to my net zero goals, it becomes a bit more complex because the greenhouse gas protocol is very focused on what you buy on scope 3, scope 3.1, purchase goods and services. It's not as focused on how efficiently did you use those purchase goods and services. It does have a category for waste downstream, what went to a landfill and the landfill gas escape component, but that's a fraction of the actual sort of GHG impact of growing all the food that we brought in and then didn't fully use, didn't use in an efficient way. And that gets lost in the current reporting protocols, this massive lever to drive improvement that is embedded inside scope 3.1. It's just not all connected at the level that it needs to be. And I think there are protocol opportunities, and I'm no expert in that zone, but to really tie it together. And also interesting things around voluntary carbon markets. There's been some innovation to get, to mint credits related to downstream food waste prevention because of that landfill gas mitigation. But the upstream part remains elusive and hard, really hard to connect the micro to the macro. And so I think that's part of why this issue has not been, it's never been the center of the climate discussion, right? Climate, we've been talking about transportation and electrification and power generation, right? All of these things have been very center, but food and ag and working lands have not been at the center of that discussion. It's at the periphery. It's gotten better. The flag standards out there, we're seeing that happen, but it's still not, all the lines don't tie together.
Yeah, you
Mhm.
talk about Project Drawdown, like one, for us, they're sort of like a benchmark on climate science, and it's something we go back to, and we were super excited about the Explorer that did identify like emergency brake, because I think that in the climate, space, there's sort of like everything is everything, and everything isn't actually everything if you're serious about climate. There's some things we have to do now,
Yeah.
and Mike and I, both we have solar, and we drive less, and we're trying to change our, but there's some fundamentals like learning about finance, where you bank makes a big difference. But food is massive. It's a massive thing. It's a quarter of emissions, like
Yeah.
something like this, right? In total. And I just wanted to get your 2 cents on how you're thinking about like this emergency brake. Is that something that has more become apparent to you? Because you started in 2004. I'm sure you
Yeah.
weren't thinking about it then. And how are you seeing that unfold forward? And kind of to piggyback on Mike's question too, of like, how do more people understand that this is a change they can make, and it's
Yeah.
financially like viable change they can
Right.
make.
When you get to the consumer level, what are the things we can influence, right? You talked about solar, we can drive an electric car. There are things we can do. Well, everyone with no investment, like of capital investment, just with how you shop and how you use the things you buy with food, you can have an impact on this, which I think is a really um, exciting, um,
Yeah.
aspect of this. And I think ultimately how we're going to solve this problem is through a lot of modest adjustments to the way people are thinking and living, right? To be able to get to a point where it's a it's something that we've changed habits around. And in fact, for Leanpath, our mission is to make food waste prevention everyday practice in the world's kitchens, and that's about changing habit and changing social norms and social license around it. And I think that that's the road ahead and the work that we need to do. And I think that, look, I'm no climate expert. I focus in food, but I'm excited to see those worlds starting to come together
Mm.
more and
Yeah.
more of that complement occurring. And it's it's helpful that things like drawdown make the point, right?
Yeah.
It's making me think that, maybe one of the simple things we can do, Dro, is just get smaller refrigerators so we can't buy so much.
How many
You know,
refrigerators do we get though? Like, could we have like
well,
five smaller refrigerators or just?
my refrigerator looks like you could fix a Cessna in it. All right. It's absurd how big my fridge is. And I'm like,
Yeah.
maybe that's the problem.
You know,
You know,
Dana Gunders, who's the president of Refed, which is the nonprofit focused on food waste, a number of years ago wrote a book called, I believe it's the Smart Kitchen Handbook, and it's for home, and it talks about how to organize your fridge. That's one of the
Hmm.
things, to be able to not lose track of the things that are going to be going out of date soon, so you use them,
Yeah.
and a bunch of other practical tips in that world. But yeah, and the home is where we can make a lot of impact on this, but also, as we transit to restaurants and as we go to the supermarket and all these things, yes, we can buy less. And I think the more we can get into a mode um, of buying more frequently, rather than giant amounts, and we forget what we have. There's a reason that has worked in certainly in Europe. It's a more
yeah.
typical thing. We have the transportation issues of driving our cars around to do that, and there's cost associated with it. But I think where it's practical, it's valuable. I used to live a block from a supermarket, and I would buy today's dinner, and that was it.
Yeah. That's so good. Yeah. Well, I have a Vespa and my store's 2 miles away. So it's a perfect combination because
Yeah.
it's a blast to drive that thing.
Yeah.
Let me ask you one other question. It being 2026 and you've battled your way and this business is rolling. Today, when your sales channel is out talking to brand new restaurants that haven't done business with you yet, how are they reacting and replying? Are they like, that's not a problem for us? Is that the denial? Are they like, welcome, where have you been all our lives? Like, how's it
Hmm.
going in a sales
Well,
process?
so there's the restaurant world and there's the broader food service world. And I will share, I think the restaurant world is a little behind on this. And the
Mm,
broader food service world, by which I mean, um, think of like on-site dining, what people once upon a time called institutional food, but it's not. It's more appropriately considered non-commercial food. So colleges, corporate offices,
mhm.
hospitals, senior living facilities, military bases, K-12 school systems. Like there is an immense amount of food served in those zones. And then in hotels, casinos, cruise ships, theme parks, those zones generally are ahead. And I think part of
Okay.
that has come, and they're very open and they are either proactively working on this problem or they're amenable to hearing about it. And I believe that's because many of them have uh, a management structure based over a large portfolio of activity, and they're looking for continuous improvement opportunities. And we've just found that they acknowledge the challenge. They also have a particular unique problem, which is that Many of them serve the same guests every day. So if you're at a college, right, you eat at the dining hall. So what does that
Mhm.
mean? If I'm the same customer every day, it means you got to change the menu every day. You need to serve me.
Right.
So if you're an operation that's changing the menu every day, you have a much steeper climb on food waste, which means you
Mm,
probably have more waste and you're more attentive to the issue. The narrower your menu, the more it doesn't change, the more you can optimize, right? So you think about some of the big QSR brands that have just optimized to the nth degree a very manageable scope. And so I think for that reason, the restaurant space has had hasn't had as full force hit on the pre-consumer food waste side. Definitely they have a lot. They have a lot of plate waste. And so I think we're going to get there. But that world, remember, has been through a lot. If we look at the pandemic and what happened to the average
Mm.
restaurant operator, my heart goes out to the many who didn't make it through that. And those who did have had to be relentless in focusing on survival and top line and new channels for delivery and all these things. So when you show up with another system, it's up to this point in the last few years, I would say they haven't been able to go there, but their customers want them to. And the moment that they recognize that their financial health can actually be stronger by not wasting food, I think you'll see that door fly open. But to date, for the reasons I just noted, it's been a little slower.
yeah, you clearly have a super strong grasp of what this world looked like. It's so fascinating to talk to you, Andrew,
We
because I think it's
lived in my little
yeah,
world for
it's
a
good to
while.
get yeah, it's good to jump into your bubble and kind of learn all this stuff.
Yeah.
It's just we want to get it out there because it's so important what you're actually working on. It's such a big deal actually what you're working on. I uh I wanted to just ask you a quick question about composting and I don't know if like is that something that LeanPath like do you guys deal with that at all like a recommendation standpoint or like what you do with
Well,
waste is like can you talk a little bit about
yeah,
that?
we're, I mean, we certainly don't want food waste going to landfills and we don't want food waste being incinerated. So the best thing, there's a hierarchy. Best thing is prevent the food waste at the source. Second best is divert edible excess food to feed people, or if that's not possible, to feed animals. And if that's not possible, then we start looking at composting and energy generation from digestion, not from incineration. That's kind of the hierarchy. And so we want people to be composting the residual that they can't prevent or donate. But of course, we want to minimize the amount that's ending up there to begin with.
Right.
Composting is, of course, better from a GHG point of view, less, it's more of a, if it's done right, it should be more aerobic than anaerobic and less methane profile. So, and there's a lot of beneficial uses for compost, right? And whether it's soil health or it's erosion control or any number of things that compost is good at. So what we do is we help people track where they sent it. So they can tell us, I'm going to send this to compost. I'm going to donate this. I'm going to put this in the landfill. And we can then report on that so that they have the ability to know how well they're doing on that and also to be able at a corporate level to know which sites are composting and which sites aren't because the infrastructure is so variable regionally. Some places have strong composting infrastructure and some don't. And so understanding where that capacity has to be developed is a part of the problem. So from LeanPath's point of view, we focus on prevention. We also help with donation, so recording donations and some facilitation. At the compost level, we track where it went, but we don't actually do the composting or manage that interface. That's a very site-specific set of issues.
Is there any standout question that we didn't ask you that you wish we had during the show?
You guys were pretty thorough, and my hope, what people have taken from this, is that food waste is a huge opportunity. And it's actually a very solvable problem, at least in the zone that I'm in. And I would argue generally, if we can get the awareness around it, and that's exciting at a time where we have issues. And I realize you asked me about the emergency brake earlier, and I don't think I finished that, but just the reality of we've got to slow the warming. And one of the best ways to do that is less methane. And what's a major methane source? Rotting food. So this hopefully is exciting to people due to the size, accessibility, actionability, and importance to solving climate problems, but also food security problems. And by the way, putting more dollars back in people's pocket or businesses' bottom line that are usually struggling in low margins. So I hope people go, aha, light bulb. Let me bring that topic into my conversations when I'm working on whatever angle people are bringing to the climate challenge. This should be part of it.
I completely agree. And that was our conclusion, by the way. So you just wrapped up our
Sorry.
own thing, because I couldn't possibly say it better than that. That was a phenomenal landing for this hour that we spent together. And yeah, I mean, I just, in my own mind, I'm like, I will never send food to the kitchen again. I'm going to finish I'm going to go back to the 70s, where you had to finish what was on your plate, right? That's like, I feel my motivation.
Balance. People have human health and planetary health. Got to have a balance in all of it, but you'll order thoughtfully.
Well,
Exactly.
What I was thinking is like, I mean, and it is part of what Leanpath. I mean, it is part of your thing. But like when we were kids, right? Like the thing was like, hey, finish that plate because there's some kid somewhere that's starving, right? They don't have food, you have food, right? And that is, part of your thing. Like, hey, this food shouldn't go to waste because people are hungry and we can feed them. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's also like this. There's this whole other thing. It's almost like I actually have arguments with my son because I don't know where he grew up, but like he'll like leave a little food on the plate. I'm like, that's not being polite, dude. Like finish everything on the plate. Like what are you doing? And then it's like a friction thing. It's kind of funny. But and then like I have like such a much deeper guilt trip to give him now. I mean, I'm gonna go like, look,
Totally.
like, dude, let's talk about, 60 to 70% emissions from producing the food farms, like the 10% to transport it, the 30% landfill methane. Like you are the problem, bro.
Invite him into the discussion. Don't scare him. I will
No,
share with you. At
yes,
some point,
absolutely.
no one would invite me to dinner, right? Because they're afraid. And so I said,
Nobody invites you to dinner.
I said, I'm a pragmatist, not a fundamentalist. We're going to make this change. The perfect is the enemy of the good. Progress over perfection, one foot in front of the next.
I'm with you 100%, Andrew.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks, Andrew.
All right.